The NHL trade deadline is just around the corner. We've talked about the top trade targets, we've talked about the sellers, but one thing we haven't talked about is who's going to be buying all of these players. Well, today I'm going to be going through my 8 teams who I think should be the biggest buyers ahead of the NHL trade deadline, and which teams I think need to make the most substantial moves if they want to be considered contenders. What's up, guys? The NHL's trade deadline week is officially here, and we already have some pretty big trades being made, with Seth Jones heading to the Florida Panthers in exchange for Spencer Knight and a first-round pick, as well as the New York Rangers packaging up Ryan Lindgren and Jimmy Vesey to the Colorado Avalanche in exchange for some draft picks. But even with these moves being made, there's still a lot of big buyers out there and a lot of great players to acquire. So we're going to go through my 8 teams who I think need to be the biggest buyers at this year's deadline, beginning with the Winnipeg Jets. The Winnipeg Jets have been a fun story this year. After receiving a ton of criticism in the offseason for their early playoff exit against the Avs last year, the Jets came out with very low expectations and have completely squashed all of the criticisms. They were the hottest team to start the year and are now coming off another 11-game win streak. But I do feel like the Jets could still improve this roster despite all of their success. One area that I would love to see them fix is their second-line center position. Nemestikov has been pretty great for the Jets this year, but I feel like if you're a Stanley Cup contender, he's more of a third-line center on a winning team rather than a second-line center. And something they could do to improve that is go out to acquire players to either improve his line or just replace him altogether. A couple players I would like to see them go out and get is one that's not really talked about a lot in Ryan O'Reilly. He has Cup pedigree. In Nashville, he's not having the best year, even though he is a good player for them and is coming off a great season with them last year. I feel like Ryan O'Reilly would be the perfect fit for this team defensively and offensively, and would really provide them with a bit more experience and offense within their top 6. I also could see the Jets trying to get a bit younger, maybe going out for a guy like Dylan Cousins, or if he becomes available, a guy like Eliaspettersson, who I think would be great with the Jets playing behind Mark Scheifele in a market that's similar to Vancouver, but maybe with a little bit less responsibility of being that top guy. Pettersson's cap hit's a little bit too high. I think Cousins is a bit more realistic if you're going younger, but I do think that the Jets should be in on a lot of these forwards if they're trying to compete this year. The only other guy I could see them going out for is Brock Nelson, who's been a 30-goal scorer throughout most of his career. But again, I would like to see them go for more of a offensive threat outside of Nelson. I just don't really like the fit for him on this team. But hey, any player offensively within their top 6, I think that's what the Jets should be aiming for. Next up is the Carolina Hurricanes, and this one you might be thinking, well, they already made their big move. They've already bought getting mikkorantanen and Taylor Hall. But the thing with the Canes is they obviously don't have mikkorantanen re-signed yet, so they could be sellers for this year's deadline if mikkorantanen does end up going back out on the trade board. But they also need to address a couple other areas of this roster, specifically their goaltending. Call me crazy. I think Frederik Andersen is that guy, and I think when he's healthy, the Canes are fine with their goaltending. But the problem is, it's always about his health. He's just never healthy for a full playoff run with the Canes. And I think if you're a team that's within your cup window, you should probably try to have a bit more security when it comes to your crease than a guy like Kochetkov, who just doesn't have a lot of experience and just might not be the guy for you come the postseason. And that's not even a knock on Kochetkov or Andersen. It's just there's not a lot of stability when it comes to your crease, and I think this team needs to have that for where they're at in their franchise. Obviously, focus on the Mikko Rantanen thing, figure out what you're going to do with him and see how that goes, but don't forget about the other areas of this team that could use some improvement. Obviously, check out some goaltenders, see if you could get a guy, not saying this guy specifically, but maybe someone like Cam Talbot, who could be a veteran that could back up Kochetkov if you need him in the playoffs if Andersen goes down, and try to add a guy to your blue line that could play on your third line, maybe be a bit more physical and just improve your defensive depth, so that way if there's issues with your goaltending, it's not really as flawed because you have the defense to make up for it. I do think they should be big buyers, and depending on how the Mikko Rantanen thing goes, maybe they'll be big sellers, but they're one of the more interesting buyers at this year's deadline. Next is another surprising team this year, the Washington Capitals. The Caps don't really need to improve in a lot of areas. They have one of the best goaltending tandems this year. Their defense has been playing surprisingly well. And with the resurgence of Alex Ovechkin, they're getting better scoring within their top six. But I do still think they could improve a little bit in that area. And there's one guy specifically that I would love to see them target, and that's Jared McCann. McCann has been the Seattle Kraken's best player by far since joining their team. And I think McCann, if he wants out of Seattle or if Seattle's looking to trade him, would be the perfect person for the Washington Capitals to acquire. He would fit in perfectly with their top six, provide them with a little bit more scoring and playoff depth when it comes time for the postseason. Not a lot of other players I could see them going for. Maybe Brock Nelson's a guy who fits their timeline with some of their young players and older players being within that lineup. But outside of those two players, I don't really see anyone else for the Capitals to go out and grab that's pretty realistic for the timeline of this team. Either way, though, they should be buying and investing. This is one of those seasons that you could actually go out and win the whole thing if you play your cards right. And I think a guy like McCann would just be perfect with the Capitals this year. So that's the guy I would love to see them go out and buy. Next up is the Minnesota Wild, a very tricky team to talk about when it comes to being a buyer because of all of the injuries that they're dealing with. And you could view this as a positive or a negative. The positive side is if these guys are out long enough, you could kind of maneuver around the cap like some other teams have. And for a Wild team that's dealt with a ton of cap restrictions over the past couple of years because of their Parise and Suter contracts, this might be a blessing in disguise if they can just stay afloat with Kirill Kaprizov and Eriksson Ek being out for most of the year. But the negative side is that you're going to fall in the standings without your two best players. It's just inevitable. So for the Wild, I think I would love to see them make a trade with the Vancouver Canucks, maybe a big time trade for a guy like Pettersson, or a lesser trade that's still pretty big for the team in Brock Besser. You have a bunch of nice prospects and picks that you can trade out if you're trying to get a guy like Pettersson, maybe including Wallstead or Zeev Buryum, who I wouldn't want to part ways with, but could be an attractive piece for the Canucks if they want to move off of Petey. There's a lot you can do here for the Wild, and if you have this cap space, I don't think you should go small. I think you should try and get a big player, and I think the Vancouver Canucks would be the perfect trade partner for them. They just went out and got Gustav Nyquist, so maybe that was their big move. I don't think that that's enough to thread the needle for the Minnesota Wild, but hey, at least they did something, and the Wild are attempting to be buyers. But I hope they just do a little bit more because they've been such a fun hockey team this year, and hopefully we can see them make a strong push towards the end of this season and potentially be a big buyer at the deadline. Next team, I would be remiss to not include the Vegas Golden Knights here. It seems like they're always buyers at the deadline, and I don't really imagine them not being buyers this year with them having a very good roster. People talk about them maybe needing to improve their forward group, but I actually would like to see them improve their defensive core a little bit more with some of the injuries that they have to Pietrangelo and Theodore. And one team that I think would be the perfect trade partner for them if they want to try to improve their depth and their defense is the Boston Bruins. If the Bruins are going to be sellers this year, and if Brandon Carlo is on the trade block, I think acquiring a guy like him to put on your second line would be perfect for Vegas. Then you would have guys like Theodore, Carlo, Hannafin, and Pietrangelo. That is a scary defensive unit with size that I wouldn't want to play against. And maybe if you're trading with Boston, you could get one of their forwards like Brazeau or Trent Frederick if you sweeten the pot a little bit during this trade. I think that would be the perfect situation for them to do. They have some players who are familiar with Bruce Cassidy, and if they had a good experience in Boston while he was their coach, maybe they would like this kind of move. But I think Vegas should be buyers at this year's deadline. They are a serious contender this year, like always, and will have the cap space and the assets to make some kind of move. We all know it's going to happen at some point. The next team on my list, maybe this one's going to be surprising, maybe not, but I have the Detroit Red Wings being buyers this year. And right now they're in a wild card spot. They lost their Stadium Series game against Columbus, but I still feel like this is the season to invest if you're Detroit. Now, they've been sticking with the Yzer plan, and it's worked out pretty well for them, acquiring a couple free agents here and there like Patrick Kane, Andrew Kopp, Tarasenko. But with Kopp on IR and you finally being able to move off of that Ville Husso contract, I think this is the perfect time to get the Red Wings back into the playoffs. And there's one team that I would love to see them trade with, and that's the Buffalo Sabres. Now, we've talked about Dylan Cousins at length today, so I'm not going to get into this too much here, but I just feel like the Red Wings lack scoring, and I think a guy at Cousins' age, with his contract and the upside that he could provide them, could be pretty beneficial to this team's season today and for their future as well. The other guy is Bowen Byram. He's been rumored to be on the trade market, and I think that the Red Wings could use some help in their back end. Maybe they're looking for more of a defensive guy, but I just think they need a little bit more help with scoring, like I just mentioned, and Byram's a good defenseman who could provide them with that extra layer of offense from their back end as well. So I think he would be a nice player to pair with Seider or place on your second pairing and just add a little bit more depth there. Obviously, they could kick tires on some other players. We've talked about Petey, we've talked about O'Reilly, we've talked about Nelson and Besser, but I think trading with Buffalo would be their best route. But altogether, I think trading in general is something that Detroit should be doing this year because I think it's high time we see the Red Wings back in the playoffs. And last but not least is the Edmonton Oilers, who I actually think are in a very interesting spot right now. I wanted to talk about their goaltending and why I think John Gibson would be a great trade for them to make, but they keep coming out and saying that they don't want to fix their goaltending, which is just crazy to me. It's not like Stuart Skinner's this guy that's so reliable and so steady for you that you should continue investing in him. Yes, he had a good run last year, but there's times where he's so inconsistent, and you could get into a first-round playoff series with, say, LA and lose because of Skinner, and that's not something that I'm really relying on if I'm the Edmonton Oilers or just a fan of the team. So I'll try to stay away from goaltending because I feel like no matter what I say here, all of you Oilers fans are going to go in the comments and be like, they said they don't want it, so we'll leave that alone. The one guy who I think they should be trying to get is Ivan Provorov from the Columbus Blue Jackets. Yes, Columbus is having a good year, and maybe they want to keep Provorov if they feel like he could be beneficial to their future. But I feel like if you're a team like the Oilers, if you're not going to fix your goaltending, then you should improve the defense in front of him. Because I do feel like Stuart Skinner reminds me of Darcy Kemper with the Colorado Avalanche a few years ago, where if you put a superb defense in front of him, then maybe he could play a lot better and look a lot better under those circumstances as opposed to what Edmonton's running with right now. I think they could always improve in their back end, but there's one other thing that's kind of holding the Oilers back, and that's this whole Evander Kane situation. It's at the point where it's like he's not healthy right now. He might be healthy in a month, which means you can't really exploit the whole LTIR thing, and that kind of stinks for the Oilers because maybe there's a play here for them to go out and get themselves a forward. Not saying they should go get a guy like Nelson, but maybe a guy like Nelson if they had that cap space to work with. Obviously, you want Evander Kane back in the lineup because if he's at his peak, then he's going to be great for the playoffs. But if he's not fully healthy or available, then it's just kind of holding this team back. Personally, I would love to see them make a swing for John Gibson. I know they're not going to do it, so I think Ivan Provorov would be the next best guy for them to get. And that's the guy I think the Oilers should be targeting the most at this year's deadline. But these are my 8 NHL teams who I think should be the biggest buyers at this year's deadline. Obviously, I only really talked about a few of the pieces that are available. There's guys like Ryan Donato, who I think would be great in Winnipeg or in Edmonton, as well as Brad Marchand, who if he becomes available could be nice. But these are kind of just the top guys that I think a lot of these teams are kicking tires on. So let me know your thoughts about available players, who you think should go where, if you think these teams should be buyers, or if there's another team out there who you feel like I left off this list that could potentially be deadly at the deadline. One team that I should mention here, New Jersey, is another one that I would like to see compete a little bit at this deadline too, but I digress here. If you guys want to see more content like this and keep up with the NHL trade deadline some more this week, make sure you go ahead and hit that like button now and subscribe to the channel for more stuff like this. Thank you guys as always for watching these videos. I will see you guys in the next episode.